and it's a privilege to be moderating this conversation, which is not only very critical to the uncertain and testing times that we're facing across countries, but it's also the first public webinar of the OECD Observatory of Civic Space. So a dual privilege really to be part of this conversation. So what we're going to do today is really hear from three very eminent speakers who are joining us in this panel on certain aspects of the challenges and opportunities we face in relation to open governments and civic freedoms. So I'd like, on behalf of the organizers, to extend a very warm welcome to these three speakers. Two of them I can already see online. So Mr. Angel Gurría is the Secretary General of the OECD and the host of this meeting. Thank you so much for bringing us together here and enabling this conversation. Mr. Darren Walker is the president of the Ford Foundation and has been making headlines and philanthropic history in the past weeks. So very exciting to have you here, and looking forward to hear more from you. And then we also have Ms. Katju Holkeri. I don't know if you're online yet. Maybe somebody from the OECD team can help us, or maybe we're still waiting for her to join. But she is the head of open government in the Ministry of Finance for Finland and has kindly agreed to step in on behalf of the Minister for Local Government, who was going to join us earlier. So all three speakers will be talking to us again about some of the ideas, but also practical inspirations on how we use this dual situation of, on the one hand, seeing how governments are further restricting civic freedoms in the guise of emergency measures in this time. We already know from civic space research that is available, including the Civicus monitor, that even before the pandemic, the onset of the pandemic, we had only 3% of the world's population in just 43 countries being able to freely exercise their civic freedoms. So that is their freedom of expression, their freedom of association, and their freedom of assembly, despite international obligations that require all countries to do the same. What we're seeing quite frighteningly is the fact that the emergency measures are being used to impose new forms of censorship, new forms of surveillance, but also new forms of abuse and attacks on fundamental freedoms in a large number of countries. And then on the flip side, you have the kind of opposing scenario of this whole groundswell of citizen action and civic movements also coming back to the fore. So 2019 was the year of people power. It was the year of activism. I mean, personally for me, I think this is the age of activism, and we're going to see a very, very different kind of relationship between governments and citizens in the next few years. But I think the past few weeks particularly has been another powerful reminder that people want the kind of accountability, the kind of transparency, and the kind of responsiveness that the open government principles actually symbolize and require governments to engage people with and around. So these are the questions that we'd like to explore more of in the conversation that we will have in the next 50 minutes. Before we get into the substance of the conversation, just a few practical announcements. So there is on the right-hand bottom of your screen a Q&A button. So everybody who is a participant in this conversation, that's the button you need to use to direct questions to the panelists. And that's where the observatory team would be picking up the points that we need to then bring back into the interactive segment of this meeting. The chat button, which we're all familiar with and use quite often in our daily webinars and meetings, that you can continue to use for your comments, reactions, to share examples and other ideas that emerge in the course of the conversation. I also want to remind everybody on the line that this event is being broadcast through the OECD TV. And then for the speakers particularly, just again, a reminder that you do remember to unmute yourself before you speak. And we're also going to want to, provide the second half of the meeting for interaction and to take up questions from the participants. So, being brief and timely in your introductory remarks would help us do that, particularly because I'm not in a position to nudge you since we're not in the same space. So having said that, I'm going to move to the first speaker that we have to address us in this meeting. So Mr. Angel Gurría, welcome again, and thank you for bringing us together. So two questions for you before I hand over. One is, how important do you think the principles of open government are, particularly in the course of this pandemic? So how realistic is it for us to be expecting governments to respond with greater transparency, accountability, and a focus on citizen engagement at this time? And then what recommendations would the OECD itself have to strengthen effective participation in policymaking at this time? You'll need to unmute your button, please.
Very important that they observe the principles of transparency, accountability, and civic participation, and absolutely that they respond to this conjuncture, to this difficult moment. Now, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Lisa, for running the show. We're delighted to host this first webinar of the OECD Observatory of Civic Space. And I'd like to thank the government of Finland, Ford Foundation, Darren, delighted to share with you yet again. As I said, that Darren and I are becoming part of the usual suspects. Every time they want a panel of something, whatever, they just say, okay, get Walker and Gurría, and there's and then of course with the Open Society Foundation, it feels like a long time ago. It was only last November that we launched the initiative, and in the context of the Paris Peace Forum. Now, we're now in the middle of this crisis, revealing the systemic weaknesses of our economies and societies. We're facing high inequalities, economic pressure, climate change, rising social discontent, disinformation. Now, all were there before, but they have become more urgent, more emergent. These have become more blatant, more obvious because of COVID. So we urgently need to rethink the interactions between citizens and governments now. We need healthy and open information ecosystems. They are vital components of civic space, and they're vital components of democracy, actually. They're key to ensure that citizens are informed, that their needs are represented in policy debates, that they can hold their governments accountable. Now, even before the disinformation campaigns unleashed by the COVID-19, became very obvious, the number of independent fact-checking organizations had already quadrupled. This is important, between 2014 and 2019. Now, since the beginning of the pandemic, many other fact-checkers are coming up. Colombia Check, Fact Crescendo in India, Pagella Politica in Italy. The reported increase in page views is several fold. So like 700 times, 1,100 times. Just going through the roof. Levels of trust in governments were very low before, and now it's very differentiated because the crisis has given rise to, in some cases, consolidation of the trust in governments, but in some cases, loss of further trust. So trust in government, was about 45% in OECD countries before the pandemic. In times of crisis, gaining and maintaining trust can be even more challenging. It took trust more than 10 years to return to pre-crisis levels in the OECD area in the 2008-2009 crisis to today. So, and there we are. We have another big issue. To rebuild trust in public institutions, a healthy civic space is essential. Space where people can freely participate in shaping what I would call the res publica, the public thing, the public policies. That will be key to successfully steering countries out of the crisis and into better, more inclusive, more resilient, what I would call a better, not the new normal or going back to normal, but a better normal. The open government principles can pave the way to a successful recovery. Transparency is key for people to be informed. Here, let me say, for example, the Italian Ministry of Health is using the direct messaging app Telegram to post official information. Then there's a question of accountability mechanisms and the question of integrity. It's essential to prevent corruption and ensure that recovery funds are well distributed. I was embarrassed and just shaken and shocked in yesterday's or day before's New York Times. The front page, at least here in the European edition, was about the corruption in all the businesses and all the undue things that had happened where people were profiting from the pandemic in Latin American countries, and in my part of the world, it was so embarrassing, so terrible, so absolutely, it was just that even that these crises bring out the best in people, the best in our society, but they also unfortunately bring out the worst, and this was a good account of the worst. So now, in the case of about accountability and integrity, the UK House of Commons, for example, implemented a digital parliament strategy in order to maintain legislative scrutiny during social distancing. Stakeholder participation also will allow governments to tap into their people's collective intelligence. For example, the French Citizen Convention on the climate change. This is, as you know, this is where the Paris Agreement happened, and therefore this is where the climate change issue continues to push. So this French Citizen Convention on climate change, it published specific recommendations for governments on how to rethink society after COVID-19. Then again, how do we take advantage of this terrible situation? How do we turn it into an opportunity to accelerate public sector reforms? Let me just close by saying 4 things. Reinstate laws governing the civic space. Please, leaders must ensure that the many emergency measures, precisely what Lysa was saying, let's not succumb to the pressure of the immediacy and the emergency. So leaders must ensure that the many emergency measures restricting in-person civic participation are lifted as soon as the health situation makes that possible. And in the meantime, governments must dedicate special efforts to creating and maintaining meaningful civic space through other means, including digital tools. Second, engage with the public in an inclusive manner. The only way to achieve a more equitable society is to listen, to incorporate the views of a wide range of voices, including minorities and marginalized groups. Then, third, innovative measures to increase stakeholder participation in the design of the recovery. Here we have an interesting example. Portugal, for example, there's a nomadic voting mechanism in the form of a bus that travels around the country for people to vote on participatory budgeting. It's just an example about picking up the voices. And finally, a multi-stakeholder approach to tackle disinformation. So we need to spread the information, but we need to fight disinformation. because it is leading so many people astray. And, you know, I was looking today at this question of the vaccine, and then looking at the efforts of getting a vaccine, and then the question of fighting those that are saying don't vaccinate your children because something terrible is going to happen to them. Well, we are seeing every day what happens when you don't have a vaccine, when you don't even have a medicament, a medicine, in order to attenuate the consequences of, and we are now preparing to fight the disinformation about the vaccination. So it's been very challenging in the past few months at all levels, but we have an opportunity. Now it's become a cliche to build back better. We really should focus on that. Rebuild the trust in public institutions, work collectively, work inclusively to shape a better, more equitable, resilient, sustainable future. So count on the OECD to work with you and for you in the design and the development and delivery of more inclusive, open government policies to support a vibrant civic space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gurría. I know there are many people on the line who are probably very happy to hear you talk specifically about corruption and accountability on spending related to the COVID response. I'm going to encourage some of them to maybe use the chat to share some of the calls that groups like the International Budget Partnership have been making to ensure that governments are involving citizens and communities in the spending that's on the ground. But further to that, I think the call you've made also to ensure that the recovery plan is both sustainable and equitable. So it's really looking at building back better in a way that sustains the planet, but it also addresses marginalization and the communities that are left behind. I think these are really important cues that civil society has been calling for, across regions, and we would really like to build further on that as well. So I'm going to move to the second speaker, Ms. Katju Holkeri, who is on a phone line. So I'm going to require the OECD team to actually just let her hear her voice so that we know she's able to hear us before I start on a few questions. So Ms. Holkeri, are you able to hear us? And maybe we could just hear you before we engage.
Yes.
Great. Okay.
I was
thank you.
Now, so I'm here. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay. Thank you for joining us and for stepping in for Sir Papatero as well. So we're very excited to have you here because we've heard a lot about the challenges. There's just seems like all of the problems we were trying to deal with in the past few years have multiplied suddenly in the span of 1 year. But there are some really interesting examples from Finland on practical ways in which to increase civic participation and engagement. So we'd like to hear from you, what these measures have been and how important have they been in increasing public trust in institutions, and therefore, based on the lessons you have, what would you recommend other countries do in a similar vein in order to build public trust and engagement with governments during the crisis?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this opportunity to attend this webinar, and also our apologies because our minister, Mr. Sirpa Pater, was going to be present, but unfortunately she was called to attend an important government meeting at this very hour, and thus she cannot be present here. And this is really a very important subject for us in Finland, an open government, civic space and trust. And to give one answer first to your question is that my message I think today would be that we can do better. So what I think is the most important thing is the constant development. And what I mean with this is that even though when things seem to be relatively speaking in a good way, there is always a need to develop further. So for instance, in Finland, we can do more, we can do better. And when times change, we also sometimes need to do things in a new way. And in the OECD Trust Framework, one pillar is open government. And the COVID crisis has shown that we need to do more and need to do things in new ways. And it has highlighted very much also the COVID crisis, the need to further strengthen civic space. And my own country, Finland, is one of those countries in the world that constitutes the 4% of countries where civic space is not restricted. And we are also traditionally a country of strong trust between different actors in the society. But yet we are paying a lot of attention currently to trust and civic space. And we have actually asked the OECD to do a review of Finland on both subjects. That is the kind of constant development and the evidence base for that, where we are working together with the OECD. And we see these two aspects in our society as core issues that contribute to the well-being of our people. And therefore we need to keep them up and our policies kind of tirelessly to take care of them both, because we think we have too much to lose if we don't. And our reasoning also for asking the OECD to review Finland has been, of course, to get a solid knowledge base for future reforms. But we also think that it is important internationally to enhance the discussion on the importance of civic space and how this space could be strengthened worldwide. So we also want to contribute to that discussion and that work. And we know that there are big challenges, of course, and that the COVID-19 outbreak has in some countries led to further deterioration of the situation with unnecessarily hard restrictions on civil society. So we want to encourage the opposite trend that would lead to strengthening civic space. And one important part of civic space is the role of civil society organizations. And to give you an idea of their role in my country, I can tell you that we have approximately 5.5 million citizens, but civil society organizations have 15 million memberships in Finland, so 3 times as much as there are people in Finland. And moreover, 8% of our people are members in more than 5 organizations. And what we think is crucial is the continuous dialogue between governments and civil society organizations. We feel that is crucial in developing the civil space further. So we have had for some time already a civil society policy board. It's chaired by a civil society organization, and it consists of both civil society organizations and civil servants. And its task is to enhance cooperation and dialogue between the two, so between civil society and government, and to strengthen civic space and to make concrete proposals on how to develop further areas that are important to civic space. So this kind of a joint dialogue, constant joint dialogue, we feel is essential to find the best ways to develop. But the times are changing, and also the role of civic organizations change, or maybe better to say roles in plural. But it's important also that our civil servants in the government, that they understand what the role of civil society is in today's world. So therefore, we are starting in the autumn a called Civil Society Academy for civil servants. So this will be a joint training and networking day where civil servants learn and update their knowledge on civil society and vice versa. And one important part of this is to further advance the concrete networking as well as joint understanding through dialogue. And also one issue that we are paying a lot of attention to, and which has also, of course, been seen as crucial in the crisis situation, is the role of public communication. And not just the reliability of the data being communicated, but what it means to trust if on a critical moment in a crisis it is difficult to understand what is said, or the information from different public administration players is not coherent. So the easy to understand issue is very important in our open government work. And to give one more example that is related to the COVID crisis is that we organized during this spring so-called lockdown dialogues for citizens, 160 discussions and over 1,000 participants. And one of the many issues that came up there was that there is a need of more information in many more different languages in today's Finland. But the lockdown dialogues also showed us again that in open government and public communication from government, listening can be a much stronger message and a tool than talking. And I think this is the very important thing in the crisis situation is the dialogue and the conversation and the cooperation between civil society and government. So we think very much that trust and civic space are crucial cornerstones of our society, and we are very grateful to the OECD that we have this possibility to work with both of these issues and strengthen the reform knowledge base for the continuous development work. So these are some ideas or thoughts from today's Finland. So thank you.
Thank you. I can honestly say that for some of us in other parts of the world, it's quite shocking to have somebody from government express such open and engaging views about civil society. I think many of us live in regions or countries where you're very not welcome to some of these conversations. So the lockdown dialogue, in fact, is one of the most frequent feedback or grievances we've had from national civil society networks across the world, because there's a consistent sense that civil society is being left out of the building of recovery and response plans across the world when they actually should be at the table. So I'm going to hold that thought and we'll come back to it again when we do our interaction. Thank you so much for that intervention. I'm just going to remind participants that we need to use the Q&A button, which is at the end of the right-hand end of your screen. It's the first time I've ever seen it on a Zoom screen myself, but that's the button you need to use for questions we want to bring up back to the speakers in the interactive session, part of the session. And the chat you can use for all of your reactions and other inputs, but it is the Q&A section that the OECD team is monitoring to pick up questions that we will raise in the second half of this meeting. So having said that, Darren, I'm coming to you now. You know that if you're the last speaker...
I just want to register the fact that I'm making the wave before Darren speaks. You know, I just want everybody to know that I'm doing the wave. No, now Darren, take the floor.
Okay, that's great. A great gesture of friendship, and I'm assuming that everybody else can do that wherever they are, and then hit the Q&A button. But Darren, coming in at the end of the line always means that you have the most difficult questions to answer. So I think what we have for you really is we really want to hear what your ideas and kind of examples are for us to be responding to this seeming backslide in civic and democratic freedoms. And how do we, in the context of the argument that emergency measures are important, and restricting civic freedoms is an important part of the safety and emergency measures that we need to respond to the pandemic itself. How do we ensure that this doesn't become the new normal in a way that it further takes away the rights that people have to engage with governments, or that it makes the closing down of governments and the removal of open government principles actually something that everybody just becomes used to and accepts and moves along with. So what do you think we need to be doing much more of, not just within civil society, but across sectors, to really hold on to that ideal of an accountable, responsive and transparent government?
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you to my friend Angel for always making me feel right at home wherever I am, whether it's on Zoom or in his beautiful office in Paris. And to the distinguished minister from Finland, it's a great honor to be with you all today. I come to you from a country that is in a major moment of reckoning. A major moment of reckoning after the world witnessed a Black American man murdered by law enforcement, which unleashed activism by civil society unlike we have known in our lifetimes in this country, and indeed reverberates around the world. I think this is a moment of opportunity, not only for the United States during a pandemic, it feels like 1918, 1929, and 1968, all in one month to we Americans. But this speaks to the world as well, because we too have been in a place where civic space has been shrinking, not at the rate that it has in the world, but certainly we Americans have seen the space for civil society be under siege in ways in which we have never seen in our lifetimes. My audience really is not civil society, because at the Ford Foundation, we believe that civil society is essential to a functioning democracy, to a functioning society. So I'm not going to spend any time talking about that. I want to talk to the wealthy, the powerful, the influential, and ask, what are we doing with our wealth and our power and our influence to ensure that the space for civil society is as robust, vibrant as it can be? Because unfortunately, far too often, we institutions, including big American foundations, lack the courage to truly engage on this question in a profound way. And I think in order for that to happen, it is going to require we powerful, influential, wealthy institutions and individuals, families, donors, to ask some fundamental questions about the world in which we want to live. And those questions are going to be not, what are we going to do to give back with our philanthropy, through our charitable giving? It's going to be, are we willing to give up something for more justice and fairness in our countries and in our societies? And I think that's the space that needs to be opened up. It is that space that needs to be held accountable for some of the injustice we see. And only through an investment in civil society can that happen. And so for foundations like the Ford Foundation, we have been in that kind of a conversation, and we found ourselves, as we have found ourselves in many other crises over the years. We are a product of our capitalist system, and our ability to give away money is a function of our investments. And like many foundations, when our investment portfolio goes down, our giving goes down. But it is exactly at that time that need in societies is usually going up. We saw that after the 2008 financial crisis, where our endowments went down, but the need, the deprivation in the global South, in the United States, went up. And so the response that the Ford Foundation, through, I think, the very bold and creative leadership of our trustees, was to say, how do we respond in this moment in non-normative ways? How do we get out of our own way, our own traditional thinking, to do what we need to do now, which is to actually pay out more money and to pay it out more flexibly, not as project support, but as general operating support. And we were, through a process of consultation, able to generate an idea for a first ever issuance by a foundation of a social bond. That social bond was issued last week. It was one of the most successful offerings by a university or a foundation in the history of the markets in the United States. The the demand for it by investors who wanted to buy social bonds was such that we were able to sell these bonds at a historic price, favorable to us, and in turn to make possible $1 billion of additional grant making over the next 18 months, more than doubling our grant making above the required legal minimum to 10%. So I say that not in a hubristic, braggadocious way. I say it to say we institutions are sitting on assets that can be levered, that can be used if we are willing to be creative, to think outside of the box, and understand the needs of people in the communities we profess to care about, and why that ought to move us to urgent action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. That was really powerful. And in fact, Civicus has joined a few other networks in doing a study across 80 countries of how governments are specifically supporting civil society. The analysis will be released this week. And I think what emerges really strongly is the fact that more than the piecemeal, a little help here and a little help there, it's really a time for us to be building a sector-wide enabling infrastructure that particularly helps local civil society organizations on the ground. And it's really time to reinvent how not just governments, but also businesses and publics can actually come together to create like a movement of local giving, across the world. And I think that's, what the Ford Foundation has done is an important first step that we just need to amplify and take towards other regions and really create that, that shift in both public and government attitudes towards civil society. So thank you very much again for that. We actually have several questions now from the participants who are on the line, and I'm going to pick 3 of them, try to frame them in a very brief and summarized fashion, and then invite all 3 of you to respond to them either together or pick any one question that you think speaks most closely to your interventions. So this is the moment when I regret not having put my glasses on, because now I have to read small font. But our first question is from Tonu Basu from the Open Government Partnership. So she's pointing us towards the fact that in a lot of countries, we are actually seeing national civil society networks play a critical role in supporting and monitoring their government responses to this crisis. And this includes promoting accountability of aid or budget spending and facilitating outreach to underserved communities. So what specific actions and reforms can we encourage governments to take to ensure that space for civil society and government collaboration is strengthened and sustained? Additionally, how can international partners, including the OECD, reinforce these efforts? And I'm just going to link a comment I've seen in the Q&A section to this question. So how can governments that are also outside the frame of the OECD, be encouraged to take this on? So maybe I should just stop there and let maybe Mr. Gurría, would you like to answer that question since it seems closest to your intervention, and then I'll get on to the others.
Well, I would say, what can they do? What should they do? I'd say there are 2 things. One is transparency, and that is where the resources are coming from, where they are being channeled to, and why. And this is because this last question of why is because resources are always scarce. You always have to choose whether you use it for health, whether you use it for education, whether you use it for infrastructure, whether you use it to build a dam, or whether you use it to build a network of telecom or just telephones, electricity, whatever. It's always a choice. And then the question is, what is what are the criteria and the selection process for the projects? And as I mentioned before, after a very broad, very wide consultation. You can't make everybody happy. There will be people who are going to be promoting the different projects, but in the end, it's about cost benefit, but it's not cost benefit in the narrow sense, but it's a public good that we're talking about here. How do you get the most bang for the buck? The other question is, once you do this, is accountability. So it's at the other end of the line. Did you get what you expected to get? Did you get the results? Was during the operation of the project, during the allocation of the resources, did they actually provide what you wanted to provide? So I would say that civil society, that civic spaces are meant to discuss both these two issues, which are so crucial to the whole concept of democracy. And it is precisely because we do not have enough transparency, we do not have enough, the fight, for example, the question of the fight against corruption that I mentioned, etc. And then the question of accountability. People were not necessarily or sufficiently informed about what was done with the money. And then there is this pervasive feeling that everything is going to waste, that everything is being misallocated, that all the resources are only serving the wealthy and the powerful, and that it's just increasing the divides in society. So I'd say just keep governments to the straight and narrow, put the pressure, transparency, accountability, transparency and accountability, one at the beginning of the process and other through the process and at the end of the process. This is where democracies will be very well served by a society at large.
Thank you. And we continue to hope that both the OECD and the countries that are part of it will be that champion, not just in the context of COVID, but also because this is a really important moment for multilateralism overall, right, with the 75 years of the UN as well. So it's essentially a narrative that we are kind of reinforcing.
And the 60 years of the OECD.
Okay, great. Okay, one more reason for us to really hold on to that narrative and reinforce it no matter where we are. Thank you for that. I don't want to be very linear, but I am going to go to Ms. Holkeri next because there are two questions here which I think would be especially relevant for you. So one, we have Flavi Fuentes from the Thomson Reuters Foundation saying that Reporters Without Borders recently compiled COVID-19 emergencies laws that have severely limited freedom of expression, including media freedom across the globe. So although these laws are temporary, their legacy may affect fundamental rights in the long term. So what can civil society in particular do to ensure that freedom of expression, press freedom, and other fundamental rights are not permanently restricted? And I'm going to add to that a question from Emmanuel Faole of Nigeria, who says he's from the he's the Nigerian country representative for local youth assembly. And his concern is, in the context of enabling civil society to do more and to protect our fundamental rights, what role do you see or what opportunities do we see for youth across the globe regaining their safe space in the post-pandemic era?
Yes, thank you. I think that one of the key issues, well, this is from the Finnish context, but I think that one of the key issues is regarding these issues is also that the legislation is not enough. You need to have the culture, and you need to also take care of the culture all the time in the government. We for instance have a very good legislative base, but it doesn't help if the values and the actions in the government are not according to the legislation. So that's why we are trying to train our people always to and update their knowledge on what they actually should do. And there, I think the role of the civic society is to keep us awake in that. So I think that's a very important thing. Of course, the situation in Finland is quite good. So there, I also think that it's important for countries to and this is also in the OECD Civic Space Framework, is to go beyond their borders when they about these messages. So not just speaking of their own countries, but trying to advance this also in other countries. And also, I think about the transparency I think it's with new technologies, like we have organized our procurement so that you can see online, almost online in real time, what the government bought, from whom, with what money. So it's available there, and it actually was not that difficult in the end to achieve. But you need to also have those people who use that information, who look at there, and our media and civil society has been quite good in also checking and asking questions about why was this, why have you purchased this with this much money from this company. Now that it's available, it's also very important that people use this information and ask more questions about it. That's just one example of how we are trying to use and provide even more transparency than before. So proactively giving out information, not just when asked, but proactively giving out the information for the civic society to then ask us more questions about it. Those are maybe the thoughts that come to my mind at this point.
Thank you so much. And I know we have just 8 minutes left in the hour, but we do have 2 more questions, which Darren, I'd like to address to you. One is from Vivek Ram Kumar of the International Budget Partnership. He says that the COVID-19 crisis is unlikely to be the last crisis of its kind that the world confronts in the next decade. So how can we be better prepared next time around to create and safeguard civic space, even as governments announce shutdowns and take policy measures that can disproportionately hurt the vulnerable and those with modest means? And I'm going to combine that with a comment from Paul Whittles in the Q&A as well about, we keep talking about methods and tools and approaches, but do we really have the political will to address the underlying causes of the issues we face and make the change that we need?
Well, I believe that the way forward, recognizing we're going to need more resiliency among our organizations, is to build their resiliency. I mean, at the end of the day, we know we are going to be living in a world with more shocks, with more disruption, with more opportunities for harm to be done to poor, vulnerable, and excluded communities. And so my question is, who are the institutions who will be there to protect and promote the rights of the citizens? Civil society. So what are we doing to make civil society more resilient? And not necessarily all civil society, but especially the organizations, the journalism organizations, the organizations that hold the elected officials accountable, the organizations that demand human rights. I mean, there is a specific community of civil society institutions who, in this regard, ought to be priorities. And so my question is, what are we doing to make them more resilient? So it is not about going from crisis to crisis and, well, how do we prepare for this crisis? How do we prepare? If you have resilient institutions, those institutions can withstand a crisis, can have the sort of internal capacity and capability to spring back and spring into action when called upon and when they see the need. So you've got to have the mechanisms for mobilizing support, international support and local support for those institutions. I don't see another way around this. If we don't have global organizations like Reporters Without Borders, like the Committee to Protect Journalists, like the International Investigative Journalism networks, these journalists are critical to be working hand in hand with civil society. And so how are we supporting those institutions of journalism, media, engagement? How are we supporting them is my question. And because I don't think we're supporting them in a way that is about institution building, we're supporting them in a way in which it's about projects and transactions and any one particular government agency to review or to assess, as opposed to saying this is an institution that is mission critical.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think that's a call that we're seeing across levels of civil society. I mean, a really strong pushback. If there's one thing that we need to come together and challenge, it's the fact that we're resourced in a way that is setting us up for failure. So we really do need to look at how, we have more enabling platforms and more ways in which we support each other rather than compete with each other, and then really work towards some of that long-term transformative change. And I can tell you that it's really encouraging for most of us here to be hearing this coming from all three of yourselves, because we're usually saying these things in our little spaces, but it's great to hear people who are also leading institutions of different kinds reinforce that and really, extend their support and alliance on this issue. So, having said that,
I'm going to apologize because I actually have another Zoom meeting where I'm the keynote in 2 minutes. So okay. I told my friend Angel what an honor I felt, and I would never turn him down. So. But I do have to do this in 2 minutes. So I'm just so grateful for the chance.
Please do go ahead. Yes.
Thank you for this.
Please go ahead, and thank you for joining us.
Bye, Angel. You're the best.
Thanks a lot, Darren. It was
Bye,
great.
My friend.
Okay.
See you next time.
So that's the kind of brotherhood we need to see more of on other Zoom webinars. But Angel, we're going to come back to you because as the host, we'd just like to hear from you before we conclude. Just in terms of what you think are, practical things we can look out for. I think there have been some comments in the Q&A as well on particularly what we can expect to see from the OECD in terms of enabling us to hold governments more strongly accountable, but also what opportunities there may be for wider multi-stakeholder engagements, including someone has mentioned in the chat your role in relation to the corporate sector, for instance, and how the corporate sector also needs to be held accountable and to civic space and upholding rights. So it'll be great to hear from you, and then we can wrap up this conversation.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Actually, let me start by the question of the corporate sector. Just a few minutes before I started with you, I left like Darren, but I did it before. I had this meeting of the Business for Inclusive Growth. Now, this is an association led by the chair of Danone, Emmanuel Faber. And it was created out of an initiative of the OECD, where we already had governments. Of course, they were pushing for inclusive growth. It was kind of a then international organizations all said, you know, we made a communique, we worked with President Macron in the G7 Biarritz meeting last year to push for this idea that international organizations were all going for, you know, inclusive growth and transparency and promoting open government, etc. But then we said, well, where the business, you know, where's the business? The business has to participate. And then we created this business for inclusive growth. We didn't know when we created this that we would be a few, you know, 9 months after that or 7 months after that, that just like we didn't know when we created the civic space, the observatory for civic space, we didn't know that we would be in this situation. But what has happened is that they've now, it's now transformed into literally billions of initiatives, billions meaning of euros or dollars of initiatives in their different ways, because these are 40 of the largest companies in the world. Actually, today, Microsoft and Capgemini or something like that just joined. So this is to do inclusive growth issues, to go for transparency, for better governance, etc., but mostly to help the most vulnerable. And I have to say, we know that there are issues all the time, whether the question of transparency, the question of privacy, the question of whether we're losing competitive spirit because, you know, some companies are too dominant, etc. And of course, those issues we have to deal with. But I just want to say there are a number of initiatives like that throughout the world by groups who understood before, but now understand even more that they have to work here. Now, let me just say, Lisa, civil society, we use the word loosely, you know, we everything fits into this, but institutions that are reminding governments all the time about the need to be transparent, to have integrity, and not only to fight against corruption, but to also to fight against incompetence, because incompetence produces misallocations, which are just as bad as when people, you know, take the money or away in their pockets. You know, maybe it's not as bad in terms of the intent, but basically the outcome is still lost opportunities. And lost opportunities always go on the liability side of the balance sheet. And as I said before, we always have insufficient resources. So you always have to choose what you want to do and where you want to do with it. Now to the corporate sector, I would say, let's you know, the question is, are they part of the problem or are they part of the solution? And the idea is that they be part of the solution, obviously, and in their own interest. And also because the power of consumers is now being manifested more and more, where you say, now companies are trying to outdo each other in terms of who is an equal opportunity employer, who is greener, you know, who is a more inclusive growth employer, who is a more inclusive growth, who is respecting the global value chains, and who is not using child labor, or, you know, not who is responsible for the whole of the global value chain, all the way to the last little bit, the integration, the creation of the cloth, rather than up to just selling in the high streets in the world. So they know that this is becoming more and more, even for like a business question, you know, that's an issue. This is now. When you talk about governments here, what are we at the OECD? You know, our motto is better policies for better lives. And that means what works better for people. And it always was, But right now, with this unprecedented challenge that we have, no single country saw it coming, and no single country still knows how much it's going to hit them, because they may be at different moments, different when it's still not yet peaked, or when it's going down already, etc. But in the cases where it's going down, you're only starting to feel the economic consequences and the social consequences, the unemployment, and in the other cases, you're still fighting the health part. And by the way, making people choose between, or governments choose between, lives and livelihoods is a false dilemma. You have to throw everything you got at the pandemic, everything you got in the kitchen sink at the virus. And the sooner you beat it, and the more wholesome that you are in terms of the strongest your victory is over the virus, then it'll be easier to pick up the pieces in terms of the social, pick up the pieces in terms of the unemployment, pick up the pieces in terms of the more vulnerable parts of society. So I would say, Lisa, I'd love to say that we have a clear path. We don't. Every day we are reacting. Every day, for example, we launched this single entry point at the OECD. We have now produced 100 policy briefs. So our tax people are doing tax and the COVID, or the 700 different decisions on taxes that are being made by all the countries in the world. They are there. We're having policy trackers that are changing in real time. Every time there's a new decision, it's updated all the time. But also 100 policy briefs in terms of what to do with the vaccines, what to do with the medical services, what to do with medical staffing, with doctors, with nurses, with paramedics, etc. What to do with digital? How do you use technology in order to help you fight the pandemic? So everything and the COVID, SMEs threatened by the hundreds of thousands, then SMEs in, for example, tourism. I mean, the single hardest hit sector. So I invite you to take a look, because all of you will find perhaps several pieces that will be useful for you, that you will want. So what do? We roll with the punches, we update, we upgrade, we try to get the best information we can. Facts are going to keep governments with their nose to the grinding stone. And again, transparency, accountability, transparency in the decision-making process, accountability, because it's not just for the parliaments, but also for the whole of society. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you for that passionate response. I think you can feel secure that all of the others on the line, there were 110 of them a few minutes ago, but are coming with equal passion and commitment to really make this a moment where we change policies for good. And it's not just a short-term response. So I want to thank you again for hosting or for enabling this interaction. I also want to thank Ms Holkeri for joining us and being part of this interaction. Thank you so much. And then finally to the team from the observatory itself, this was your first public webinar, but we do hope it won't be the last, because there are so many more questions that we need to unpack and so many more answers that we really need to organize together for both evidence and action. So with that, because we're already 10 minutes over time, thank you everyone who's been on the line and given us 10 more minutes of your life for this conversation. And we're looking forward, since it is the 60th anniversary of the OECD, looking forward to many more opportunities to continue this conversation and develop action together. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.